CYHAWK series, the trophy on the line this weekend. One of the better matchups in week 3 of college football. We got Levi Stevenson on the line from Wide Right and Natty Light. It's the SB Nation platform for Iowa State as the Cyclones take on the Hawkeyes at home. Levi, traveling to the ball game here tonight. We appreciate you stop by and give us a look at the game.
Yeah, no problem. Just getting into Des Moines right now, actually. I live about 2.5, 3 hours away, so we came here the night before. So we'll probably be cracking the first beers probably just after 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, I think.
There you go. Yeah. So if you can give us a look into the series, because this is something that I'm a college football nerd, so I know quite a bit, but I can certainly learn more. But there's a lot of people out there that think about all the matchups that we talk about, maybe the closing weekend of the season,
right?
When talking about rivalries. But this one, unique, special. Anytime it's in state, it means something different. And certainly with the limited population and the proximity, give us a feel for the culture there.
Yeah, so the CYHAWK rivalry is really interesting because Iowa doesn't have any professional teams. You know, we have a AAA baseball team and an AHL hockey team, but and a D-League team, or G-League team, I should say. But other than that, we really don't have any professional sports per se. So Iowa State and Iowa football is about as close to the NFL as it really gets in Iowa. And it's an old rivalry between two fan bases that do not like each other. I know Iowa's known for having lots of nice people and stuff like that, the Iowa nice or whatever. But, we set that aside for this week and throw some jabs to the other fan base. And it's, it's a lot of fun, and it's a really intense rivalry. I think that gets overlooked a little bit. People think, when they think of rivalries, they think of Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Auburn, USC, Stanford, all this or whatever. But Iowa and Iowa State is genuinely one of the more intense rivalries in the country, where it's genuine dislike for the other team. It's a rivalry that's, over the course of the history, Iowa owns a lead in the series, but especially since Dan McCarney took over in the late '90s, it's been a lot more even. Iowa's gotten the last 4. The series has evened off quite a bit since Dan McCarney came in the late '90s, and Iowa's gotten the last 4 of the series, but it's been very competitive. And this year is by far the most anticipated one that we've had probably ever.
Absolutely, it should be. And I'm a guy that has grown up with this series, again, from the outside, from a college football national perspective, just thinking, okay, Iowa's the better program, but Iowa State seems to kind of hang around and give them a good game most of the time. But Iowa's the program that should win this thing 8 or 9 out of every 10 years. And that's probably what has been the line on the game anytime you would take a decade's look at this rivalry. But as you mentioned, my goodness, Matt Campbell, what a job he has done at Iowa State over the last few years. And it's just a different ball game in terms of getting some national look, because the programs are good, both of them, and they have been good for the last few years. And Iowa State now something to be reckoned with in the Big 12.
Right. The transformation to a winning program, where a one that's on the verge of becoming a perennial winner, has happened a lot faster than anybody expected. We expected a turnaround to happen. I don't think anybody saw it coming as quickly as it did, and to be as sustainable as it has been, especially with the offensive line being as inconsistent as it has for the past few years, and having a revolving door at quarterback. None of that seems to phase anything. They're extremely consistent. I should say they're extremely consistent after the middle of September. October has been very friendly to Iowa State the last few years, and we're hoping September will be a little bit kinder to us as well going forward. But Iowa is one of the last things that Matt Campbell has to conquer yet. He's beaten just about everybody else. Hasn't beaten Texas yet, which he'll have the chance to do that later this year in potentially a really, really big game. But he's already knocked off Oklahoma. He's knocked off Oklahoma State. He's knocked off TCU. All these teams while they were ranked. So this is the next big mountain he's got to climb, and he's put himself in a great position to do that so far. So we'll see if they can finish the job tomorrow.
Got Levi Stevenson on the line from SB Nation's platform for Iowa State. It's Wide Right and Natty Light. He's traveling to the game there in Ames. And, of course, the Hawkeyes get together with the Cyclones, one of the best games of weekend 3 in college football. And can you explain to us, give us some kind of indication as to, we know that Matt has done an amazing job, but how has he gotten it done to this degree?
So it's two parts that are related. So Iowa State for a long time has had a real problem on the offensive and defensive lines. They've had some playmakers on the outside, had good running backs, have had good receivers, have had good defensive players, especially linebackers. But the defensive line has always struggled. The offensive line has struggled outside of a few individually good players. So part of from a personnel standpoint, to build from the inside out, starting interior of the defensive line and then building out from there. And you can see that the great example of that is on defense, on the defensive line, where you have Ray Lima, who's one of the best nose tackles in the country, and maybe even the best nose tackle in the country, that anchors the middle of that defense on the three-man front, that has actually still, surprisingly been really good against run. We would not expect three-man front to be good against. But he's the reason that is working alongside other good linebackers and defensive ends and things like that. That was one thing from the beginning is building the offensive line, which is admittedly it's still lagging behind the defensive line because offensive line just takes a little bit longer to develop. There was some lack of accountability, lack of work ethic, and we have our own podcast called Down the Pipe and Natty Light that I host with a couple former players, one of whom is Cole Nett, and he was a kicker. Played under both coaches. Most of his career was under Paul Rhodes, where leadership triumphed, and there was people in the weight room putting in the extra hours that are needed to be a really good program. Matt Campbell found those leaders. Dave Montgomery is, his part of his story, part of his legacy at Iowa State will always be that he was the guy that basically single-handedly changed how Iowa State does football. That this, as kind of the legend goes, after his freshman season, when Iowa State went 3-9, but did finish the season strong. It was in January on like a late Friday night. The coaches were just getting ready to leave the building at like 11 o'clock at night. And who's showing up and who's out there running wind sprints out on the practice field? Dave Montgomery. He's putting in the extra work on Friday night instead of going out like most college kids do, going out to the bars. Dave Montgomery stayed, he worked, and he did drills. He worked to perfect his craft. And eventually that became contagious where people started joining in with him. And then it was just the whole team. That's what they did. Instead of going out on Fridays and Saturday nights, they're staying in, they're watching film, they're hitting the weight room, they're going through drills, receivers are running routes, whatever it is that they need to get better, to perfect their craft, and to create the winning culture that Iowa State has now. Yeah, so right now, as far as running back goes, right now it's still a group of 3 or 4 guys that are going to get carries. I think against you and I, you had a bunch of guys that were like 11, 12, and 14 carries, so they're getting a pretty even workload. They all averaged 4.3 yards a carry, so they were all effective. None of them, really stood out necessarily, but they were all effective enough where you feel comfortable with them being in the game. They were all used a little bit differently. Where Sheldon Croney he's kind of more of a power back, and Matt Campbell was perfectly happy to lean on him in the fourth quarter and overtime to get the yardage that you need. Freshman Breece Hall, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of people, he's got by far the highest ceiling of any back in the room at the moment that's going to be getting carries. We've heard some really notable things coming out of camp anyways, just some of the comments that we've been hearing from people that have been able to watch and have eyes on training camp, that he's got the highest ceiling. This week you'll probably still see a fairly balanced workload between the 4 backs, between Breece Hall, Sheldon Croney, Johnny Lang, and Kene Nwangu. You'll still probably see a fairly even workload. But going forward, it would not surprise me at all to see maybe a couple of them sort of rise to the top, especially Breece Hall, maybe Johnny Lang. But they'll all still get plenty of carries throughout the entire season because they're all a little bit different and they can all be used in different situations. At receiver, it's more about youth right now. The talent is there. There's a couple guys on the roster right now that are probably more naturally talented than Hakeem Butler was. They're not as tall, obviously, and they don't have that crazy freak reach that he does. they're talented in different ways. Milton is a guy, he's great route. Tariq Milton is that guy, and he gets open, he makes plays. There's a couple freshmen, especially Joe Skates, that has been showing out really, really well. He was a highly recruited guy coming out of high school, had offers from a lot of different blue bloods, Ohio State, Michigan State, things like that. He's been showing out really well, and we know as he gets more reps, he'll have a chance to take over. So the receiver room is definitely not short on talent. It's more just short on experience. But you will see plenty of them throughout the season. And as they get more reps, that the leaders in that room should emerge pretty quickly. And part of the solution too with replacing a guy like Hakeem Butler is the tight ends. Iowa State has 3 very good tight ends. They all do something different. Charlie Kohler is the best receiver. He's an NFL tight end. He's a modern NFL tight end in every sense of the word. He will be in the NFL in a couple of years. And he can be a great receiving threat. Chase Allen's a good route runner. Dylan Sainer is more of kind of an F-back type thing that'll be a lead blocker in the running game, but he caught a couple, he had a catch against UNI and had a couple last season too. So they'll use those guys pretty freely all over the field. So maybe you don't see the one singular deep threat that can just totally overpower anybody like we have with Allen Lazard and Hakeem Butler the last, 6 years or 5 years, I should say. But you have different threats. You have faster threats, more reliable catchers. Hakeem Butler dropped the ball a lot. I think it was at 15% was his drop rate. You have a bunch of guys now that are probably going to be below 8%, which twice as good at catching the ball as Hakeem is. So is 2 catches underneath for 10 yards worth just as much as one catch for 25 and 1 drop? That's the difference there, basically.
Yeah, I always heard the knocks against Hakeem Butler, and I knew that they were legitimate because I heard them from enough credible sources. But every time I tuned into Iowa State, the guy was making ridiculous plays all over.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. And he was, he could take the top off of any defense.
But, yeah, especially the last 2 Oklahoma games, the Washington State bowl game. He made some just amazing catches in the second half in that one against Washington State. We got Levi Stevenson on the line. He's covering Iowa State for Wide Right and Natty Light. It's the SB Nation platform for Iowa State. Brock Purdy and the boys getting it on against the Hawkeyes, trying to break a 4-game losing streak. Purdy still a young player, but now he's gained experience. Where would you gauge his development at this point?
He's ahead of pretty much any passer that Iowa State's had since Brett Meyer, probably. Right now, he was one of the most efficient passers in the country last year amongst all quarterbacks. I think he was 6th in quarterback rating last year. I think he was 12 spots ahead or 12 or 14 spots ahead of Trevor Lawrence. Statistically, he was better than Trevor Lawrence in almost every way. Maybe not from a raw yardage and touchdown perspective, but from an efficiency standpoint. Depending on how much stock you put in the PFF grades and stuff like that, he rated out as far as catchable balls that he throws, what percentage are catchable. At almost every distance down the field, he was either first or second in the nation in catchable ball percentage. So he's on target. He's extremely accurate. He's smart. Obviously, we've seen that he can do a lot of damage with his legs, especially with that pump fake that we saw against Oklahoma State. He breaks it out every now and then. He did it against UNI as well on a touchdown run that ended up getting called back. He is far ahead of a quarterback that Iowa State's had in a long time. And the great part, too, is that unlike Kyle Kempt, who's is extremely smart, doesn't make mistakes, doesn't throw interceptions, not going to wow you with his athleticism, obviously, is that Brock Purdy is still actually a more efficient passer than Kyle Kempt ever was, and he's a lot more versatile. And what we saw like last year in the Iowa game is that Kempt is a statue in the pocket. He can't move. He's not mobile enough to get away from a pass rush. Brock Purdy is. So he can do damage by extending plays on rollouts. He can do damage on read options. He's a much more versatile playmaker than anybody Iowa State's had in a long time. I would expect him. Last game against UNI, he was right at 74% completion percentage. Obviously not pushing the ball downfield a lot, but he was making lots of smart decisions, taking lots of underneath routes, taking the safe underneath routes to get yards where he can, and not worry about trying to force the ball into places where, where you're creating more and more unnecessary risk. So basically, Brock Purdy's ceiling is incredibly high. And as he has a chance to evolve and grow within the offense, and the offense is now tailored around his skill set instead of them having to kind of have a watered down playbook to help work with his youth. Now you don't have to worry about that. Now you can really unleash Brock Purdy's skill set.
And on the defensive side, we could certainly have some type of debate about the best defense in the Big 12, especially when it comes to just sheer talent. Maybe Texas is king. TCU and Iowa State would be right there. But in regards to production on the field, the translation to this point of the last couple of years would have to go the Cyclones' way. Are they going to be as good this season, do you believe, in the Big 12 defensively as they have been?
They'll be every bit as good. There's a real chance that they're better. Defensive line is deeper with talent now. The linebacking core has an embarrassment of riches at the linebacking core. I mean, you have guys that are sitting at third on the depth chart that would start for a lot of other Power 5 schools. Mike Rose is probably the best single linebacker in the conference. Marshall Spears was still a first team All Big 12, so you can't forget about him. He's one of the best coverage linebackers in the conference. Orion Vance has actually taken over. He was so good that he pushed Mike Rose over to the outside linebacker spot, over to the Sam linebacker, and is now the starting middle linebacker. So that tells you how good Orion Vance is, that he was good enough to push Mike Rose to a different position. And then behind them, you've got Will McDonald, who is everybody is absurdly excited for, because he's a athletic freak. That can be a really deadly edge rusher, and I would expect to see him make some noise against Iowa with Nate Stanley not being a scrambler. Keep an eye out for him. I mean, literally the first play of this guy's career was against TCU last year. First play he gets in there and gets a strip sack. First ever college play as an edge rusher, and goes in and gets that. And I know the staff is extremely excited about using him. You've got other guys behind him. Then back in the secondary, you have Greg Eisworth, who is one of the most underrated players in the country at any position. He is an absolute cannonball at that star position. He's by himself as one of the best safeties in the country. Plenty capable of coming up and playing as a third or fourth linebacker if he needs to. He's all over the field for Iowa State. Led the team in tackles by quite a wide margin last year. But that wasn't sometimes when safeties lead teams in tackles, it's a bad thing, because it means that guys are getting into that second level, and that's just who's there to tackle. This was Greg Eisworth making plays at the line of scrimmage as a safety. He is a very good player. In my mind, should be high up on a list for a Thorpe Award by the end of the season. And around him, you've got really nice young corners, Detrone Young and Anthony Johnson, that don't have a lot of game. They don't have a lot of years behind them, but they both played a bunch of games last year, and they're both extremely talented. The big key with Iowa State's defense is depth. Last year, I think it was 3 or 4 games in a row, they had 24 people or more make a tackle in a game. So you're talking about you can rotate out, you can sub in the entire defense to a second 11, and you're not going to lose any production, because the scheme is so good and because everybody knows their assignments.
Talking Iowa State, we got Levi Stevenson on the line from SB Nation's Wide Right and Natty Light, just making his way to the game. And, of course, the Cyclones and Hawkeyes will get it on tomorrow afternoon. This is a matchup, of course, against a team that could win the Big Ten Western Division. The last 2 years have been just completely ends of the spectrum. 2 games 2 years ago, one of the most exciting affairs in college football, 44-41, just a momentum swing, crazy game, fourth quarter overtime. And then last year, the Hawkeyes had it under control defensively. Iowa State made a number of blunders, 13-3 game in Iowa City. Nathan Stanley still the quarterback. They lose the 2 NFL tight ends, number of playmakers on defense. I'm sure even though your focus is on Iowa State, you got some thoughts about the Hawkeyes and what they could do this season, what they bring to the table tomorrow.
Yeah, so defensively, Iowa's always going to be good. Their front seven's always rock solid. AJ Epinesa is a monster. He caused a lot of trouble last year, and Iowa State will probably I'm not going to say that I won't say that they will focus a lot of attention on him, because I think that would be a mistake. You focus enough attention on him to limit his impact, but if you totally if you totally change your scheme around one player, then you're leaving yourself vulnerable all over everywhere else basically, and you're really going to be getting bogged down. So they'll do enough to limit his impact as best they can. But in the end, Iowa's defense is going to be pretty rock solid. They're worth noting, though, is that the back end, their safeties, they've had some injuries. They have some depth issues there. So Iowa State could look to push the ball down the field if they can get Brock Purdy enough time to throw. They could definitely try to use their athleticism advantage in the passing game and really try to push the ball downfield. Flipping over to the other side of the ball, Iowa's got Nate Stanley, who's pretty good, doesn't make mistakes, his deep ball leaves a little bit to be desired, can be pretty inconsistent on that. They've got a good offensive line. They've got solid running backs. Last year, they did struggle to run the ball a little bit for a few different reasons. This year, they lose those two tight ends, Noah Fant and TJ Hawkinson, but they do have a talented receiving group finally for the first time in a decade, where you're actually paying attention to the Iowa receivers outside of a couple garbage catches throughout the game. So now that's going to draw the attention in the passing game as opposed to tight ends. Worth noting, though, is that part of what made Iowa such a matchup problem for Iowa State for a number of years is because Iowa State's team is built around stopping Big 12 teams, around these the high-flying air raid offenses, things like that. Totally different from what Iowa runs with their zone read running scheme that they're just going to ground and pound you all day and night. So it's interesting because they're part of their new, more aggressive offensive attack is predicated around pushing the ball downfield a little bit with their talented receivers. Unfortunately for them, that plays directly into the strength that Iowa State's defense is built around, which is not giving up deep plays and stopping the run, which is now exactly what Iowa's offense is built around. So it's kind of interesting because they're in Big Ten play, they should be more explosive. They'll put more points on the board, but they're playing directly in, and they're eliminating some of their matchup advantage that they've held over Iowa State for the last however many years. So it'd be kind of interesting to see how Brian Ferentz approaches that, if he's going to try to continue with this new, more aggressive offensive scheme, or if they're going to kind of go back to the old Iowa ground and pound and just keep run the ball 50 times in a game.
Yeah, so for a series that we've seen Iowa regularly a 25 point favorite in the past, it's about a 1 or 2 point line, and it has been just for the last few years. And obviously, I note the last two games being extremely close, as the Hawkeyes are about a 1 or 2 point play against Iowa State. I'm going to assume, Levi, that we can point everyone over to your site for predictions over there.
Yeah, we've got predictions over there. We've got a couple podcasts that we've been doing. Pretty much all the coverage you'll ever need to get over to get you into into tomorrow and into 3:00 p.m.
All right, Levi, first time on Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. We appreciate you jumping on, even during your travels, to give us a look into a game that we definitely needed to preview, and hope to have you back sometime.
I appreciate you having me on. I'm glad to come back whenever you need.